Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Junior Faculty Forum. Today is a different Junior Faculty Forum because otherwise our JFF is a platform where we discuss draft papers and we invite discussants to comment on those draft papers so that it is helpful in some or the other way to the authors. This time we have slightly changed our pattern and we are here with a PhD proposal. Our author is Rezaur Rahman, and he has a fantastic PhD proposal on failure of Bangladeshi secularism, prospecting a new normative approach to secularism. So we have a PhD proposal which we'll be discussing today. For our discussion, we have three fantastic discussants: Dinesha joining from Colombo University, Professor Tarunabh Khaitan joining from University of Oxford, and Professor Swati Jhaveri joining from University of Melbourne. So this is a fantastic proposal, I think very relevant, especially to South Asian constitutionalism, and a topic I'm sure which is close to constitutionality and political theory. So we'll start with our discussion today. So I'll hand over the discussion to Professor Swati first for her comments.
Thanks, Swati. So that was a great introduction to what we're trying to do today. So Reza, thank you so much for giving us your proposal as sort of a way to speak to people who are interested in the forum on just the idea of crafting a PhD proposal and a thesis proposal and what goes into it. So Dinesha, Tarun, and I are going to just cover different components of a thesis proposal, and in doing that, engage with your proposal and hopefully give you feedback that you find helpful in finalizing your proposal. So we're going to look at sort of how do we craft a research question and a research problem. We're then going to look at that whole idea of literature review and how much literature review you need to do to contextualize your research project. We're then also going to look at how do you kind of sell your research project, and not in a sort of a, I don't mean to debase what we're trying to do here, but more in the sense of how do you convince readers and people who are looking at your research proposal about its proposition? What is a unique proposition that you are seeking to bring to the field? And then we're also going to look a little bit at the idea of methodology and how you kind of think about methodology and fit it to your research questions. So I'm going to do the first one and just looking at research question and how to craft your research questions. So I'll start by just saying a little bit more about how I think about the idea of research question and the criteria that go in through my mind. And then I've identified sort of 4 areas where it might be useful to just think about a little bit more about your own research question and the way you problematize what you're seeking to research. So in no particular order, I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things I think about when I'm thinking of a research question. And I say in no particular order, but I think the first one is always the front of my mind is it interesting? Is it something that's going to be of interest to not just the field, but to you? I think sometimes as academics, we try and kind of leapfrog into what's going to be interesting for the field. And then we kind of bypass what might be interesting to us. But it's really important to think about what's going to sustain your interest and your attention for long enough, especially when you're doing something like a PhD, because it's a psychological mind game as much as it is an intellectual one. So to kind of sustain the psychology of it, I think it's important to think a little bit more about how interesting the question is to you. And then align that with the field. So that first criteria I have is just interest. So when we kind of hear from you later, I'd just be curious about your interest in the question that you're looking at. The second criteria is how focused is your question? So some people talk about making it a specific question. I'm not sure specific is the right heading for that criteria. I think it's more about, is it a focused enough question so that you have a really strong anchor that you throw into the sort of the ocean of your research to kind of keep you keep you sort of, anchored into something. So how focused is your question? The third is relevance of your question. So I think some, relevance can be interest-based relevance or relevance to the field, relevance to current events. But I think to just think about what is your metric for relevance of your question, I think is an important thing as well. The fourth is viability and feasibility of your question. So am I using the right kind of methodology with my question? And that's something we'll talk about later. The fifth is it researchable? Is it arguable? Is it provable what I'm doing? Or am I trying to prove an unproven or an unprovable thing? And it might be connected to methodology, but I think it's a separate criteria that goes into it. Two more to go. The sixth one is your question complex enough and layered enough to really have breathing space with a PhD? So kind of contrary to what I was saying about focused, you also need to have a question that's complex enough or has a lot of like room for growth, because a PhD is such a sustained piece of research. You don't want your question to kind of run out of steam into your second chapter. It has to have enough steam to take you to the end of your thesis. And then the last one is originality of your question. So you're working in a space, secularism. There's so much written about secularism. So I think when Tarun comes to talk about sort of what is your unique proposition on secularism, I think that will be quite important feedback to just have in mind on just what are you going to do with the field in Bangladesh and just the broader normative space, because you are trying to engage with the normative question as well. What are you going to do that's sort of your unique offering to those conversations? So those are sort of my 7 criteria. I want to pick 4 up to bring to you, to just food for thought. Again, no particular order here. So the first is just looking at your research proposal and your research question. The last sentence. So I intend to pursue the following research questions. Why has the existing model failed? And what could be a viable normative alternative? So the first thought I had was, what is the balance in your question? So how much are you going to be focusing on A versus B? So A being more your negative critical thesis and B being your positive thesis. So one question I have is, what is going to be the balance in your thesis? How are you going to balance out these research questions throughout your thesis? The second is, as it's currently drafted, it's the smallest components of your proposal, but I feel like it needs a lot more airtime in your proposal than it's getting. A lot of airtime is going into contextualizing your research and the literature review, but I mean, others can disagree, but I feel like I need a lot more on just your question, because there are some hefty ideas in there that I think could do with a lot of unpacking. So, your third sentence, this approach has failed to confront majoritarian biases, Islamic reactionary forces, reduce intercommunal tension and violence, and protect liberal ideals. Now, those are 4 very huge kind of negative criticisms of the model of secularism that you're going to be analyzing. And I feel that that needs so much unpacking. And it goes to the point I was making about focusing your question. So when you have such big ideas thrown in, I feel that unpacking can help you bring into focus what in particular you might be wanting to focus on. So that's just a second. So balance of question and just the unpacking of your research question and giving it a lot more airtime in the proposal than it's currently getting. I think it deserves a little bit more attention. The third, and I think this is more of a suggestion on how you can elongate the coverage you have of your research problem in question, is to think about the structure of your thesis. So what do you want, for example, each chapter in your thesis to cover when it comes to the different components of your research question? What are going to be the building blocks, and how are you going to kind of link chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3, chapter 4? So it's sort of like a big jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together to get you to your hypothesis proving sort of, big whammy finale in your thesis. So I think if you thought structurally, it might help you a little bit with the research problem and the question. So something Dinesha was talking about when we were discussing what we want to cover today is just the idea of a research problem and how to kind of use a research problem framing in your thesis. So you might want to just, strip back, just step away from the proposal for a while and just ask yourself sort of 4 questions. What do I know now? What's the problem with what I know? Why does this matter? And what do I want to do about this problem? So I think if you kind of just wanted to start to think structurally, you can just center yourself around those 4 questions to build a little bit more on what you're trying to do. What's your hypothesis? What's the sort of the real problem that you're trying to tackle? What do we know about the problem? Why is it such a big problem? Just sort of use some basic guiding questions to stretch out what your research question is. So that was the sort of the 3rd reflection I had. The 4th and the last before I hand over to Dinesha is, I wondered about the viability of the question. I don't doubt this is a completely viable topic and a completely viable thesis. I'm thinking more about when you submit it for application or for, for review, or just when you're applying to places. I know nothing about this topic, not nothing, but I mean, I know very little about this topic, right? So my immediate thought was you're wanting to use kind of a constitutional normative framework to address some very real, sort of almost sociological issues on the ground. So my immediate thought was, is this a viable thesis, or is the thesis using the right methodology to address the research question or the problem? So I felt there was a delinking in the way your thesis is presented, not in your question. So we're talking about framing, not your actual thesis project, which to me is an extremely interesting project and definitely is a question that needs to be answered. So I probably should have started with that as a word of encouragement, that this is a great project and you should definitely do it. But these are just reflections I had on how it can help you to really help others see just why this is such a critical project to do. So just my 7 criteria on research questions generally, and sort of 4 more specific reflections I had on your research problem in question.
Yes. Thank you, Swati, so much for the your insights on research question and the purpose of this research, the purpose of the research. Also, before moving to Dinesha, I would quickly mention something for which I'm intrigued to know about this. On the research questions that you spoke, one, I think this is the page number 2, page number 3, that talks about the field work will inform the first and final part of the project to respectively gauge the reasons for the failure of secularism and invite responses to the new model. Now, this the mentioning to the respondents about the topic, failure of secularism, would this also have a bearing on maybe conditioning their responses? Specifically, if we are talking about those who have a bias against moving to a secular model. Also, the second, I just want to know that whether in framing these, is there distinction on how the responses from academics is taken and how the responses from judges is taken? Because there's a higher possibility of academics being more critical and maybe little unbiased vis-a-vis the answers we get from the judges. So I'm just intrigued and curious to know about this. So, okay, so we'll move to Dinesha now, who would talk about literature review. Yes, Dinesha.
Thank you, Swati. Hello, everyone. And Mohammed, thank you for giving us the opportunity to read your proposal and engage with it, and to use it more generally also to talk about how we should think about a PhD proposal. And I mean, depending on whether time permits, even respond to some of the questions that Swati just raised about, bias and expert opinion, etc. So now I will only limit myself to responding to your literature review, and I will, like Swati Jhaveri did, also sort of say a little bit generally about what I think is the purpose of a literature review in a PhD proposal. So I think what Swati Jhaveri said at the end about how you frame your project is a good point of departure to talk about a literature review. A literature review, I think, is a part in which you can tell the story about what has gone on before in the story that you are going to engage with, because our research in many ways is our opportunity to either retell a story or add to a story. So from that perspective, I also have, I think, about 7 or so minor points, and I'll go through them very quickly. One thing that I wanted when I was reading your research proposal is an explanation about the key terms and concepts that you used. Understanding that these are provisional explanations and you will probably have a different approach to explaining these terms and concepts as your research progresses. But it would be helpful to know how you think about these key concepts and terms. Now, why am I saying this in relation to literature review? I think there is a connection between how you do your literature review and then how you use that review to explain the key terms and concepts. So to say it simply, one is to say, well, I agree with the approaches that have come across in the literature I've read so far, or I am dissatisfied with the way in which these concepts and terms have been explained, and that will then help you to connect with the other components in your research proposal. The literature review, I mean, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the term literature review, but for the want of a better term, we are stuck with it, I think. But in reviewing the literature, our purpose is to say, well, this is what has gone on, and this is the gap. And for me personally, when I engage with this whole thing of engaging with the knowledge already existing, I think of, again, that idea of storytelling. So this is the story so far, or these are the stories that we have so far, and this is the part that is not explained in the story. So you do a clear job of that in your proposal. You identify the gap, but I think there are a few other components that you can add to that identification of the gap in order to lay the foundation for your proposal and make it stronger. So think about your audience, Mohammed. Some of the people who read your proposal might have a very close and granular understanding of the Bangladeshi context. Some may not. Now, only you will know who's going to be reading this proposal in a way that's going to matter. So you will need to then decide how much detail, depth, range that you're going to offer in your literature review. My sense about this is, because you don't want to err in either saying too little or not covering the range, that you should manage the word limit, use the footnotes and the space that you have in terms of tools in order to give the maximum range possible and as critical as a depth as possible to your take on the existing knowledge in this area, right? Mindful that most people who read this proposal will probably not know much about the Bangladeshi concept. Speaking as someone who also studies a jurisdiction that a few people outside of the jurisdictions know little about, this is a perennial challenge that we have to all learn to navigate, I think. So that's about audience. And when you think about identifying the gap, sort of relating to your audience, I think it's helpful to see ourselves as having an educational role. We are setting the field or setting the stage to explain why our proposal is an important one and one that that's going to add value to the field. But in doing that, you are also educating your reader and educating and sensitizing them to the perspective that you're bringing, or the perspective that you're going to bring to the field or to the body of knowledge. And there, and this is where I think this is also part of how we convince somebody that your proposal is good. You need to convince your reader that you are familiar with this field, that you have a good grasp of the field, that you have been able to interpret the field, that you can move between the different discussions and debates in the field. I'm sorry, my dog wants to join the conversation. So it's important that you give the reader, particularly the evaluators of your proposal, confidence that you are extremely familiar with the field. And I think a literature review is a good place in your proposal in which you can do that. And relatedly, this is a good opportunity to demonstrate your ability to think critically, to be engaged, and to also think in innovative ways. Because you're saying this is the field, but these are the limits to the knowledge that is already there. And this is why I think there is a gap. This other point I'm going to say is much more tentative than what I said so far. And this is something for you to think about. And I think Swati Jhaveri and Swati Parmar touched on this. When we write as those who are studying the law and writing a literature review, we will probably look at other scholarship in the field of law. But almost always, when we make proposals for studying a question in the law, we are touching implicitly or explicitly on knowledge that is developed through other fields. So the question that each of us have to decide for ourselves is, to what extent am I going to connect to or relate to the other disciplines? And then of course, there is a question then about my own capacity to engage with that literature or to interpret that literature. So what is the place that I'm going to give to literature outside of the law in my research proposal, right? How am I going to use it? And finally, the literature review can be used to reveal your instinct about about the problem, why it matters, and why you think what you're going to do is an advisable thing to do or a useful thing to do. So it is an opportunity to communicate to your reader your curiosity, your worldview, and your instinct about this problem that you have identified for yourself. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dinesha, so much. So your last point actually was very important, because you mentioned about deciding on what things at the periphery of your research you decide on putting in and then excluding. And that's, I think, very pertinent, especially for scholars in law, because law touches with so many other intersections, and to decide that question is really difficult. Okay, so thank you, Dinesha, for your comments. Let us now invite Professor Tarunabh Khaitan for his comments.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. So I'm going to build upon some of the themes that Swati and Dinesha have already touched upon with more specific examples from your own proposal, Rezaur, before talking about the so what question and the methodology issue. I've been trying to share a PDF file here, which is proving slightly more complicated. Let me just see if I can find an easy way to do it. Just hold on, because it will be, sorry, no, there's no easy way to do it. Right, I'm going to share that.
If you want to email it to me, I can try and share it while you speak.
Sure. Okay, well, here is the link. It's Sandhya Pahuja's excellent chapter on writing a research proposal that I'll recommend to everybody who's working on it. And I'm going to share my screen to point out a few things from there. So if you can see this, can you see my screen now? Yeah, okay. So here is the first thing I would highlight from this chapter by Sandhya. The first is the 4 things you need to ask yourself. What is the question you're asking? What is the object of your inquiry? How will you interpret that object? And finally, the so what question. Why does this matter, right? And which is what I'm going to focus on eventually. But in asking the first thing, what is your question? I think that this proposal needs to do some work. Right? So let me return to the questions that you have put down here, right? Your questions are, why has the existing model of Bangladeshi secularism failed? And what could be a viable normative alternative to the present model of secularism, right? Now, the first question is what any lawyer will tell you is the classic leading question, right? In a PhD topic, you cannot start with a question that presumes anything controversial. You have to establish it, right? So there are at least 4 questions that you need to ask to establish the premise of your first question. And I'm going to post them in the chat room here. So apologies for the fact that this is bold text. I did it in order to distinguish my text from yours, but in my notes, right? So I think in order to know whether, instead of why, whether the existing model of Bangladeshi secularism has failed, we first need to know what secularism is. We need to know what the Bangladeshi version of secularism is as practiced, right? So these are not normative questions. Then we need to know what are the criteria for judging its success, and then to assess whether it has failed before we can proceed to your question, which is in some ways the 5th question in this chronology, right? And by assuming an answer to all 4 of these questions, you've already jumped many guns, right? So come back to Sandhya Pahuja's paper now, which she, in this table, I hope you can see this, right? Puts very nicely the types of questions that early career scholars and PhD applicants tend to ask, which is on the left-hand side, which she calls straight line questions, and the questions one ought to ask, which are more research-oriented scholarly questions, right? So the straight line questions are, what should we do? She says, instead of asking what should we do, the question we ought to ask is, how can we understand as scholars, right? You're not writing a policy brief here. You're not working as an advocate. A PhD thesis is about knowledge expansion, right? What can you tell us after, what will we know, find out from this thesis that we don't already know? It's not primarily about making the world a better place. And if you confuse the two, you lose sight of what you're really doing. If that is what you want to do, if advocacy is what you want to do, that, right? But the PhD is not the route to do that. The PhD is your time to explain and understand the world, right? So instead of asking, how do we make a given law effective? A better way to ask is, what does the law do in the world? Right? Can you see how you have made exactly the mistakes that she says are so common? Instead of asking, what is Bangladeshi secularism? You have jumped to the normative question. How can we make it work? How can we fix it? How can we make it perfect, right? Or good? Straight line question number 3, does a particular law or norm meet its aims and objectives? Your success question, right? Instead of that, a better way to frame the question, what relation does a particular law or norm create? And with what effect? what is going on with the secularism framework in Bangladesh. Right? So basically, I'll stop sharing my screen, but I would strongly advise you to read that chapter carefully, and I'll email it to Swati, and you can circulate it to the group, Swati, the PDF, if you like. But I think all of your questions and the entire framing was basically problematic in exactly the way that Sandhya Pahuja identifies. Now, don't take that to heart, because the reason why Sandhya Pahuja has written about this is because this is the most common thing that students do, especially in law. We all want to fix the world, right? But the problem is that we don't stop to first understand the world. And that is why the questions I have posted are much better questions for you to ask, and not necessarily in that order, because I'll come to that in a moment, right? That may not be the right order. What is secularism is a very contested question, right? It may not be the first question you want to start with, but you can start with what is Bangladeshi secularism, right? Which is a descriptive analytic question where you can understand by its own lights, how have Bangladeshi politicians, constitution makers, those who use the term, judges, civil society actors, theorists, scholars, how have they understood secularism? Right? Because secularism is also a basket of goods. It's a word that could include potentially religious freedom. It could include religious non-discrimination. It could include religious non-establishment. So there are many components to it, right? It's one label for many different ingredients, and maybe you need to deal with them individually, because the label perhaps, hides more than it reveals, it obfuscates, right? So look at those individual components, perhaps. What is the Bangladeshi secularism's approach to religious freedom? What is the Bangladeshi secularism's approach to religious establishment? What is the Bangladeshi secularism's approach to religious non-discrimination? Right? So there are all these questions to be answered. And then, if you're interested, since you're interested in success and normative question, right? What is the criteria of success? We can't assume it has failed until we know what it set out to do, right? So is the criterion of success determined by an internal point of view of the Bangladeshi constitution framers and politicians and judges who think this is the purpose of secularism? And then you can ask whether the purpose determined by their own lights was realized or not, or whether you are prescribing an objective purpose for secularism from the outside. Is it, the growth of a secular society? Is that the endpoint? Is it absence of religious violence? Is that the endpoint? Is it a broadly peaceful society, a broadly tolerant society? So secular state institutions, right? The endpoint, the purpose of project has to be identified and articulated, right? And again, by Sandhya Pahuja's light, a better question would be to set the success conditions by the institutional lights of the Bangladeshi experience, not objectively and normatively. What did they set out to achieve? And was it a mission for state institutions? Was it a mission for protection of rights? Was it a mission for transforming society? They're all completely different goals, right? And changing society is much harder. And also how to change society. Achieving non-violence or reduction in violence is a lot easier than achieving a largely secularized majority in society, right? So all of these goals are very different. So ask yourself, what are they trying to do with these goals, with these instruments of secularism? And then you can do an objective assessment of has it failed by its own lights, right? And by the way, that itself would be possibly too much for a PhD. Right? So if you do this stuff, you will not even come to your normative questions. My view is that the first question, what is Bangladeshi secularism? Well done, is probably already a very ambitious PhD topic. So how does this connect to the so what question, which is your final section in your proposal or potential, right? For a PhD topic, the so what question does not turn on. So let me read out some things from your potential section. Say it'll be instructive in formulating stable policies. Sorry, I have two dogs at home today, and they are just eating bananas because somebody was at the door. Okay, so in your last sentences, constructing a model, presumably a normative model of secularism responsive to South Asian realities. You can't do that in a PhD topic. You can't even do that in a lifetime's work devoted to the topic. That's setting yourself up for failure. And they are both policy objectives. What will work in the Bangladeshi context is A, not a question you can answer in a PhD of this sort, and B, you cannot answer it without having social science skills, which I'm assuming, as having been trained as a lawyer, you don't, of qualitative and quantitative research. And I'll come to methodology in a moment as well, right? So know your limitations as well in asking the kinds of questions, because that's not just a normative political theory question. A normative political theory question would be, what is an attractive model of secularism? But in order to ask what is an attractive model of secularism that will work in the Bangladeshi context, you need to go beyond normative political theory. You need to use sociological methodology tools. You need to understand the impact of state policies in a context like Bangladesh. You simply, that's a vast, vast project. And I would say not only impossible for a PhD, but a sort of project that will require, multiple people from multiple disciplines over a number of years looking at the problem, right? So you are setting yourself up for failure by putting these as your goals and agendas. So then what is a viable and reasonable and desirable so what question? It is, what will we learn from this PhD that we don't already know? That is the question you need to ask. What is the knowledge payoff, not what the policy payoff is, right? So if you can do a grounded, contextualized, granular PhD thesis that takes doctrine seriously, because when reading this proposal, I know I'm being harsh on you, but right, this is harshness that comes from a place of love, because I think that this project has immense potential and it's fantastic, and it can be one of the first fantastic pieces on the use of law and religion in Bangladesh, the relationship between law and religion in Bangladesh, right? So it's tough love, but you need to hear this, and it's better that you hear it from me now than after your book is published. Will you find supervisors for your current proposal? Yes. Will you end up doing a PhD? Yes. Will it be a good PhD and a good book? No. Right? So what is the knowledge payoff here? The knowledge payoff is, first ask yourself, what are my skills? You're a trained lawyer and you have political theory expertise. What will those two skills brought together allow you to do? You're trained, I suspect, given what I have read from you, in analytic philosophy. You have the ability to look at concepts, to distinguish them, to analyze them, to see how establishment is a different idea from religious freedom, is a different idea from religious discrimination, is a different idea from religious influence on state laws and family law, etc., is a different idea from conflict between religion and gender and sexuality, is a different idea from majoritarianism and multiculturalism, etc., right? These are all related, of course, but they're distinct. That's your theoretical philosophical training. Your lawyerly training allows you to go deep into what Bangladeshi law actually says, what its history has been, how it has transformed over the years, the contestations in Bangladesh, the debates, and not just big picture constitutional law, the preamble and the directive principle on secularism and the place of Islam, etc. But going deeper to look at sub-constitutional laws, statutory laws, regulations, case law, right? That kind of granularity, I have not seen any work that does that, that takes the law seriously, doctrinal law seriously. Any work, and including the work that you cite, appears to be of a very high level of abstraction. Right? What you can bring to this field is to, going back to Pahuja, right? What is the law really saying and doing here? And beyond the big picture, beyond the high constitutional level of abstraction, can you bring that into conversation with analytic and political ideas, but analytically and descriptively, not normatively? Hold off judgment. I'm not one who will ever say don't judge, but I will definitely say be slow to judge. And the PhD is not the time to judge. The PhD is the time to find out what is. You can leave the postdoc to figuring out what ought to be, right? But you have to first figure out what is before you get to what ought to be. Doing it the other way around, you'll go into circles like many of the other people, right? So that is your payoff. That is your strength. And that makes the best use of the skills that you have. And that will be a book that will have a shelf life of decades, not months. That will be the distinctive book that will shape the discourse on how to think about Bangladeshi secularism and, dare I say, secularism itself, because you will be asking the question at the level of granularity that very few people have actually done, even in other contexts. That is the answer to the so what question, that I will move beyond the big picture abstract ideas, that I'll add to the knowledge and do it in a context which people have not talked about. Why is the context important? That is also the payoff out of this project, right? Because secularism studies in a majority Muslim country has largely been restricted to Turkey, which is an entirely different context of secularism. And the control of the military and the vision of secularism there has been very different, right? Bangladesh is a completely different case study. It will challenge assumptions about the coexistence of, the possibility of the coexistence of secularism and Islam, which many people make, right? In the context of rising Islamophobia around the world, that is the intellectual payoff of your project. To think about the importance of secularism and the debates on secularism in a largely, at least until recently, poor context with deep ingrained poverty. That is the intellectual payoff of your project. That this is not a Western obsession. And even in the global South, it's not just an obsession of complex, heterogeneous countries like India, right? I'm not saying Bangladesh is not complex, right? But on the religion question, there is a clear religious majority. So what is that tradition? These are the ways in which you answer the so what question, but sincerely, because you have to bring these issues to come to bear in your project. Does the fact that Bangladesh is a poor global South Muslim majority country have a bearing on its thinking on secularism? In a quasi-democratic context, right? Or at least a democratic authoritarian context, which is slightly different from the Turkish context of military democratic relationship, right? So those are the things you need to grapple with, right? The devil is in the detail. And that's how you can distinguish yourself. That is how you would answer the so what question. I know I've taken far too long. So I'll just say some things on methodology, right? It's your research question that dictates the methodology, not the other way around. And your methodology cannot be left hanging in the air. So I often use a canine metaphor, which is you have to know which is the dog and which is the tail. Your research question is your dog. Your methodology is the tail. Right? So when I see you will do interviews, I was baffled by it. Why would you do interviews? Which research question are you asking that requires you to do interviews? You have to connect your research questions to your methodology. So your methodology has to follow the research questions and explain, I will use this method to answer this question. That's the first thing you need to do. Methodology follows the question. And then you have to ask, obviously, in the explanation, not just in thinking, you have to ask this first, right? Do I have the skills to undertake this method? Don't do interviews if you're not trained in the qualitative methods of social sciences. You'll do a bad job. And this is with due respect, this is not, maybe you're trained in it, right? But unless you are trained in it, I would not do it. And unless it's really necessary for answering that question, I would not do it. So don't just throw in things because some other project does it. Right? So, okay, so I will wrap up there. What I want to say, oh, by the way, I also want to send this paper by Cecile Laborde. I know you've cited some of her other work, but she has a paper on minimum secularism, which might be interesting to you as well. So minor point. Okay. So what is the sum of it all, right? When, there's an anecdote about a very famous painter. This is a made up story, I think, painted a beautiful picture and hung it in a gallery. And then lots of people praised it and said, this is beautiful. This is amazing, right? And the painter said, look, I get a lot of praise, but I want to improve. So he put a note under the painting saying, here's a brush and a pot of black ink. Please put a black spot on the part of the painting that you think could be better, could be improved, right? And he comes back after a week and there's basically a black picture there, right? So sometimes you can go away from these workshops thinking, oh, this is just all entirely pointless. That, we have highlighted so many errors, so many mistakes, so many things that could be better. Right? But that would be, shush, Priya. That would be a mistake. What you want to go away with is, and if this was a rubbish project, trust me, I would tell you, don't waste 3 years of your life. I'm not telling you that. What I am telling you is that this is a really exciting, really useful, and really promising project. And you are really well placed and uniquely placed in some ways, because you also come from a context, again, without being patronizing, if you'll allow me to say this, where you have had the training and the resources to execute it in a way that very few people do, hitherto. Right? You have had, 2 excellent master's degrees. You have worked with one of the experts on religion in the world, Professor Tariq Madood, right? So notice what you can bring to this project, find your unique voice and your motivations, and make them your strengths. You can do a brilliant project, but it requires more thought and more and more work. I'll stop there and let's hear your responses.
Yes, thank you so much, Tarun, for your insightful comments. And on the dog and tail analogy by you, I'm reminded of a fantastic paper which tells us that how your research questions may organically lead to your research methodology. And that is Preeti Pratishruti Das's paper from 2019, Indian Law Review. It is Rape Adjudication in India in the aftermath of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013. So I specifically wanted to make that as an example, maybe not related to this but the style in which those are connected. Okay, thank you, Tarun. So we will now invite Reza for his takes or responses.
Right. Thank you so much for the comments. And, you know, I would like to start with what Professor Tarun said, that, it is often it's difficult to, you know, hear the, criticism of your project. But I think there's a whole idea. I mentioned the last time when I talked with him, the idea was to understand whether it was a good enough for it. I actually started with that question, that, because when you apply, you do not know, you do not get to know what actually was the problem, right? So I think it's really, really helpful that you're being very honest about some of the, comments. And actually, it's quite um, something to think about, because when you say, hear that your the question that you're more interested to pursue is something could be very ambitious. So that it gives me a sort of thing to look back and contemplate or reflect that what I can do with it. So, well, I know I don't have much time to respond, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of thinking to do before I sort of respond to it, because I think most of the comments are very important, and this is something I can actually reflect on it. It's not about publishing it; it's about making it better for the others. So, I would take on a few things from our panelists today. So, probably in terms of uh, Professor Jhaveri's comments, a few four ideas. I'd probably take on one particular question. He was saying that about um, what why is it interesting, and I mean whether, because it's important that you actually show why you are interested to do that. And I think I wouldn't go for the sort of anecdote to it, that why it was interesting, because as a law student, when the state religion was declared, retained, when secularism was revised in the constitution, it sort of steered my interest that, in a society where it is trying to be secular, brings in state religion in the constitution, so creating some unique, complex situation in Bangladesh, a country where it's going towards a more of Islamization and in its violent form. So a country that aspired to be secular is, bringing this complicated mix is itself is a challenge. So this is where it sort of instigated my interest to sort of pursue a project, and I did it during my master's, try to understand whether this is compatible or not. But then it sort of, when I work more onto it, and I realized that it's not just important to understand what is compatible or state religion and secularism, but rather to understand the question, the secularism itself, whether the secularism we have in the constitution or in our laws was actually something that we can work with. What are the dynamics behind it? Why is it the right sort of framework? And this is what it is, the source of that normative sort of inquisition, that what could the alternative. But then I go back Professor Tarun's statement that but then I have to actually go back and ask few questions that have not been answered, right? So yeah, I mean, the interest comes from that. And to sort of address one of the most complex constitutional problem that has always been addressed by the historians, or sort of the political scientists, from sort of a narrative that what happened since the independence, rather than sort of dissecting the secularism itself to understand the problem itself. So that's what make me interested to pursue that. So that's the source of interest, and I think I have been reading or about or writing a certain extent about it for last 5 years, and I still, as I said, today I still hearing those interesting part of this questions that need to address. I think it has enough firepower and steam to sort of continue some of the one of the things that you mentioned that it must have. Well, in terms of, one question you mentioned about whether it is viable, well, now I have to go back and think, because, the two things, some of the things that Tarun mentioned is something I need to look at. Well, I was always Well, I'd be honest, as I was always skeptical about it. So, and, this is not the first time I'm receiving comments, and it is sort of a, you can say, a combination, a lot of ideas coming from both person of political philosophy, political theory, person doing a research, qualitative research, lawyers, jurists. So this is a sort of a combination, and different people have different interests, and this is somehow probably the reason why it has sort of question that requires the we get the question of balance, because that's one of the question you mentioned, that whether the first question is balanced to the second one. I always think about it, but then again, when you're applying for a PhD, you try to attract your audience, that it can't be just a normative, because when you putting it to a lawyer, say, this is a normative project, why the hell you're doing in the law school? So that's somehow probably the reason why it has question that looks imbalanced. In terms of, so I'll come to the methodology part. So I'll be addressing Professor Parmar's questions with Professor Tarun's question on methodology. In terms of Professor Dinesha's question about connecting disciplines, I think this is one of the things I actually struggled with, because it started with a legal question, but then I sort of drifted away intentionally towards a political theory. So it has that element of political theory than the law. I mean, that's one of the things I always hear from whenever I approach your law school, that why you are here, this is not a legal project. Why are those legal elements to it? So that's something I struggle with. But then of course, I mean, this is a project that tries to sort of connect between what is in the law and what is in the political theory, and sort of try to connect it. But within this a very shorter context or shorter scope, it was a sort of difficult to make the balance. But it has this knack to make a cross-cutting, sort of a cross-disciplinary approach to the problem. And I realize this is not just a legal or a political theory problem, but a problem that needs to be together. So I think this is very important, that what you mentioned. In terms of the what you say in the literature review, that what not much can be helped, because I mentioned in a very shorter form that there isn't much work on it. I mean, of course, there are some questions about state religion, role of Islam, or constitutionalized religion, but it doesn't much question about the secularism itself. It is sort of taken for granted that what we have, or in a very a larger stroke, and saying that secularism wouldn't work. But there isn't much question, neither in a comparative politics, or comparative constitutional law, or political theory, theorists in Bangladesh talking about this problem in general. So there isn't much literature to work around it. And I think it's sometimes difficult to sell this idea to people, that, so that they often consider this as this is a scholar's inability to address the problem, or sort of hiding the literature, but there isn't much. So I think this is something I would definitely follow up with some of you, to understand that how sort of try to make them understand that literature gap I'm trying to address is actually there, instead of something that I'm conjuring to sort of attract the interest that, oh, this is a very important and interesting problem. So yeah, I mean, of course, these are some of the interesting ways how I can sort of sensitize the audience, that those are very important. Professor Tarun sort of, as I said, it sort of steered sort of my way towards the problem. The few question you mentioned, I mean, about some of the things I need to address, I actually, it's not the first time I'm hearing this, because people want to understand before they're going towards the problem, that why it failed, why I coming to the why question before actually explaining whether it actually failed or not, or more larger questions, that what is secularism, or what is Bangladeshi secularism, what are the criteria. I think these are the questions I always often get. I mean, what are the debates around it before actually going towards those noble ambitions about finding the right model? I think I would, I wouldn't say I disagree with it, Professor Tarun, but I'd say the why question comes because there are enough elements to show that the secularism as it is. I clearly mentioned that when I'm talking about secularism, I'm not talking about what different meanings of secularism that exist in the discourse, rather than a secularism that is in the constitution. That's something in application, like for example, secularism has equal respect. So I'm trying to use some of the examples in the proposal to show that these are the things that we wanted to address when secularism was adopted in 1972. Like some of the things like sort of prohibiting communal violence, sort of control the reactionary force, religion-based politics, sort of bringing communal harmony and tolerance. These are some of the things that we wanted to achieve through secularism. And I think it's not there because it's a short proposal, but in the Constituent Assembly debates or debate afterwards in the political discourse, these are the narrative that has been always there, that these are the things that we need to achieve. And I try to show that these things have not been achieved in last 50 and more than 50 years, and that it is, so there's intolerance, there's there's a constant communal violence, there are extreme use of religion-based politics. So this sort of I wanted to try to argue through this background that what we wanted to achieve through the sort of equal respect sort of model actually didn't work. So that's why we need to go back and ask us why it didn't work. So that's the context of asking the why question. It may be not, it's something I need to think about again, but I think there is enough elements to show that and you mentioned, Professor Tarun, that what are the criteria of success. I think if I can sort of lay out again that these are the things that we want to achieve, this is what we mean by the successful secularism model or success of secularism. I think in last 50 years, it can be argued that those are the things have not been achieved. And that's why I actually move towards the why question, that why it failed. Another reason and more practical reason to address, I don't know how much time I have, Professor Swati, 5 minutes, 2 minutes?
Yeah, sure, you can have 5 minutes, sure.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. So my plan wasn't actually to start with the why question, and it may sound outrageous that you wanted to go to the most difficult question without addressing that, but why question comes more from a practical perspective. I mean, I pitched this idea to a political theorist a couple of times, and especially the Professor Madhu, and he was saying that before actually talking about alternative, it's actually important to understand the why question. And this why question is something is connected to the methodology part, that why it happened. And if I start explaining it based on secondary sources, I was thinking that if I sort of try to answer this question from secondary source, it may not sort of address the real answer. So that's what is the source of this methodological interest in terms of sort of doing qualitative research. And of course, in terms of skill set, I'm not trained as a social scientist, but I do have experience. But that may not be now. But since I was also looking for applying to politics or political science, one of the things that they will have some training before I actually go for the interview. So I thought that having the reflections of the people, because at the end of the day, it is something that is reflective about people's perception about secularism, because there are work and people actually rejected it. I mean, whether Bangladesh needs secularism or not has always been contested by mass, though the political elites had always been argued that secularism is the right way of doing it. This is one of the debates in Bangladesh. So from that perspective, there is a sort of interest to address empirical one. But I wanted it to be a normative theory, normative project rather than empirical one. So that is the reason behind, sort of doing that. That is to try to understand people's perception about why it failed, rather than just trying to explain it through existing text. In terms of, the potentials, I think, yes, I agree. And as I said, that's why I said that is more ambitiously at the end, that trying to find a South Asian model. And I think that's something this is something that I was thinking for last few weeks about reading about so much about Western secularism and having so much commonalities in South Asian context, whether we can have one. So that's sort of ambitious one, but I was trying to sort of find a normative model that is politically, acceptable, and of course, something that can be applied in policy level. But I think we are, as a lawyer in Bangladesh, we are sort of trained to find the solution to the problem. We, instead of policymaker, is the lawyers who also ask sort of to know, you need to not only problematize it, make us understand what the problem is, rather than sort of find a solution that we can work with. So probably that is something, that is a reason why it has this sort of policy sort of implication towards the potential. But yeah, I duly agree that it was too ambitious, and I think it's more about understanding the problem. Now, well, I know there are questions, but I definitely would like to follow up with our panelists to understand that whether the asking those questions, what Bangladesh secularism, is it actually something of interest? I mean, of course, Professor Tarun did sort of mention why it is something that is a unique problem and that can have a potentials, but is it in a true sense, is it potentials? Because in the context of Indian secularism discussion and its potential, it's difficult to sort of say that this is an interesting case, because it's sometimes this idea that India has this holistic sort of implication that sort of submerge all other problems. Is it a unique question from that perspective? Whether people actually wanted to know why secularism failed, or whether secularism has failed in Bangladesh or not. That's something I definitely want to go back. I mean, I know these are interesting questions, but why going for normative? This is the reason. That's something I need to show that, yeah, I have something to offer, not just for Bangladesh, but something that sort of have a broader implication for the Western audience, because this is where I'm applying. But I may be wrong. That was a reason behind sort of moving towards more of a normative project than asking probably the question that has more value to it. So I'll stop here, and thank you for the comments.
Yes, thank you, Reza, for your responses. So now the floor is open for any questions or queries from our participants, and we already have one question in the chat box. I'll read it out. This question is directed to the panel. It reads, people doing multidisciplinary research have to cover story, applying suitable methodology, and choose an approach, for example, TWAIL or critical legal studies. What would be your suggestion for those planning to work on multidisciplinary topic? Any checklist?
Can I have a go at this question? And maybe in light of also things that Reza has said by way of response, right? So the first thing I would say, Reza, is your project proposal is not the space for making an argument, right? So when you say that I have already shown in my proposal what Bangladeshi secularism is and how it has failed, that's not going to cut any ice with anybody. Right? The proposal is not a research article. The proposal is a way. So if those two claims, what Bangladeshi secularism is and what its success criteria are and that it has failed, if those three questions have already been answered in the literature, then your proposal can show that literature, show what objections have been made to it and how those objections have been answered and what is the state of art on the literature. And then you can perhaps move to the normative question. But in a short proposal, if you think that you can answer these huge questions in one paragraph each, and then justify going to the normative question, that's not going to work, right? So I'm just telling you, honestly, if this proposal comes to me in Oxford, it'll be a reject. Because I would think you've not done your homework. You're asking a question without addressing the prior questions that need to be answered, and without showing to me that the literature has answered those questions before you're going to go to. So this is like, I have an allergy to normative work at the doctoral stage anyway, because I think it's usually badly done and they make really bad books. But even apart from that, and I know that it's not just Bangladesh. Everywhere law schools expect normative work, right? Because everywhere law academics tend to have an identity crisis about whether they are scholars or practitioners, and tend to do policy work and normative work and answering the should questions, right? So this is not just a Bangladeshi problem. But I really think that, you need to appreciate what a serious PhD would look like. But on the discipline question, right, which Imran has posted as well, and something came up, right, which is, you said something about, because I'm applying to politics as well, I'll just throw in the question, right? Interviews, even if you want to do interviews, you have to, in that section, if your proposal has to be sound, you have to show why using that method will answer which question precisely, right? So what would you do the interviews for? What will it give you? What is the method? What is the scoping? What kind of questionnaire? Will it be rigorous? Will it be, things like that? What is the sample size? All of those things have to be addressed in the proposal. Otherwise, it'll be seen as a weak proposal. And combining that to Imran's question, Imran, so, you say methodology and approach. And I don't understand that. I know, again, this is extremely common to decide an approach over and above the method, right? But I don't know what that means. All you need for a research project is a sound question and a sound method. If you say, I'm going to look at it from a feminist lens or a 12 lens or a critical lens or an analytic lens, right? If what that means is that I am only going to look at the literature from within that style of writing and ignore other literature that is not feminist, not 12, not critical, or not analytic, even though relevant to my question, you're making a mistake or you're not being scholarly, right? Because you are choosing your tribe and saying, I'm only going to read things my tribe has written on this question, right? That is already, like, the scholarly project has already failed. If you are parceling out an entire bunch of writing because it does not fit your approach. Or on your approach, you could mean that it's not about literature choice, but it's about certain presumptions and ideology. Again, that's a mistake, because in a scholarly project, everything has to be on the table, including the presumptions and ideological commitments that you bring, right? Being a scholar is emotionally difficult. Being a scholar requires you to challenge your own ideas before anybody else's, right? So the comfort of an ideology has no place in a scholarly project. So I would just delete choosing an approach from that list. If you're not comprehensive about your literature review, and if you're not questioning everything, then you're not doing a scholarly project. So I would only think about your research question and your methodology and be absolutely comprehensive about your literature. And the third thing about your cover story and literature review, and I think this is what Dinesha meant when she said she has some difficulties with the concept of literature review. I think it serves nobody to have one chapter in your PhD, which is the literature review, right? Engaging with the literature is a style of argumentation, which is you have to know the entire literature and incorporate it throughout your PhD. A PhD that does not know relevant literature is a bad PhD. But literature review is not the sort of thing you do in one standalone chapter and then you can go on to do your own thing. The whole thing has to be interwoven with the relevant literature. So I would not think about telling the story in terms of, in the proposal, you have to tell the story because you need to identify the gap in the literature. And maybe in the introduction, you have to say what you're adding to the literature, which is why this book is worthwhile. But you don't need to have, in my view, unless your institution really insists on it, you don't need to have a chapter called literature review where you have discharged your burdens of engaging with the literature. Engagement with the literature has to happen throughout the topic, throughout the thesis. Sorry, that did not answer your interdisciplinarity question at all. So I'll just say quickly that Interdisciplinarity, again, is a question dictated by your research question, right? So interdisciplinarity means that if your research question demands multiple disciplines, that is when you think about multiple disciplines. If your research question demands only one discipline, then you don't think about multiple disciplines. And it may be that you have two research questions. One requires political theory, the other requires law or whatever, right? But remember, dog and tail, you have to distinguish the two. So if this means that you don't do an interdisciplinary project, then don't do it.
Yes, thank you, Tarun, for your comments. So do we have any other questions or suggestions from the participants?
I think we'll see just one from
Yes.
Arpita, which is about just being mindful of skill set when you're sort of embarking on a thesis. So I think it's something, Arpita, that's close to my heart. So as law students, we don't necessarily get sociological methodologies training, is your question. But while doing social legal study PhDs, we do need to engage with those methodologies. So basically, how do you work around this? I think, honestly, I think it's about, I'm speaking just from personal experience, about just knowing the limits of where your methodological training goes and seeing that as a starting ceiling to how far you can stretch your research question into methodological terrain that you're just not like familiar with. Because as you point out in your question, any methodological work you do without the necessary grounding and training is going to be open to criticism and will just fall short of the standards and rigor required for a PhD thesis. So I think the only way to go about this is either to train yourself specifically in that methodological training, or to rethink your research question. It probably isn't a very satisfactory answer, but I think it's the honest answer I have, that I think you just have to know where your training takes you and what kind of research questions are open to you, and they have to be tethered to your training. But I don't know if Tarun and Dinesha have anything to add to that.
Well, I do, but I'll wait for Dinesha because I've spoken far too much.
So I would definitely agree on limiting yourself to what you can do legitimately based on your training. And if you're thinking beyond your PhD project at other research projects, I think a way to navigate this is to work with people from other disciplines. And that can be a lot of fun. You learn a lot more. And then you also begin to really track the way in which problems exist in the real world, which is as problems. And then you bring different disciplinary perspectives to interpreting that problem. And I just want to underscore what Arun said about looking at what is and offering your interpretation on what is before we get into the question of what ought to be. So just to encourage you, Rezaur, to appreciate that distinction, because we are not going to be too effective in prescribing if we haven't clarified what is. And sometimes when we get into the question of what is, we may discover new ways of thinking about that problem, which may lead us to a completely different place, even if we do want to dabble with what ought to be. Thanks.
I'll just add a few things. First, on Swati's comment, I have not seen or supervised a PhD proposal that did not change significantly from the application itself. So it is absolutely standard for proposals to evolve once you actually start doing the work. This is not a contractual obligation where you have said, I will ask this particular question in the institution, and your supervisor will bind you and say, this is the only question you'll be supervised on and none other. Yes, there is an expectation that you will stay in the ballpark, but PhD questions and topics evolve in consultation. In fact, the first term, at least, if not the first 2 terms, are spent just chiseling away at the question. And, most PhDs start with the supervisor telling the student your question is too broad. And you make it narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower, and then a bit more until it is viable for a 3-year project, right? So if you end up in a social science department, then, there will be opportunity to explore social science methodologies while you're also being trained in that method. But if you want to propose a social science method, don't propose it out of ignorance. It's better not to say, I'm going to use social science methods, than to say it without knowing what it entails and how it works. Because then you make your proposal sound really weak. It comes across to anybody who knows about it. And if you want to talk about it, if you want to use it, do some research. There are plenty of methodology, social science methods, qualitative and quantitative handbooks, right? Train yourself at least sufficiently to pose the right questions. Otherwise, the flaws will be all too obvious. The second thing I want to again emphasize what Dinesha said about asking the is question, and this was also this came across in your response as well, Reza, right? Sometimes we just assume that the is obvious and plain, and how could anyone possibly disagree that Bangladeshi secularism has failed, right? But until you get into it deeply, you don't know the answers. And you will certainly not take your readers with you, right? So this is about the research project. We have to challenge our own preconceptions, even with the is. Right? And the third thing, which I failed to answer in my first round, which was your final question, is this project interesting? Will it be interest to Western readers? Okay. So every question that enhances human understanding, genuinely adds to our knowledge bank, is an interesting question. There are power dynamics in the field of knowledge, like there are in every sphere of human activity. And therefore, the number of people who will be interested in the nature of Bangladeshi secularism, given current geopolitical power, including soft power, will be fewer than the number of people who are interested in the nature of Indian secularism, which in turn will be fewer than the number of people who are interested in the nature of American secularism. Does that make the question less important or less worthwhile? Quite the opposite, because the nature of American secularism has been done to death. And anything you might add to that debate will be so tiny and so minuscule and probably a repetition of what somebody else has already said, that it is a pointless exercise in most cases. Whereas whatever you will say in the Bangladeshi context, given where we are and how little we know, I mean the body of human knowledge on Bangladeshi approaches to religion, the advance that one PhD on Bangladeshi secularism will make will be so huge, where the starting point is next to zero, that in terms of the opportunity cost, if you don't do a Bangladeshi project and end up doing an American one, it will be a huge disservice to scholarship, right? So you have to also ask yourself, why do I want to do this? I'm not saying, we have to be strategic. You want a permanent job at the end of this PhD, maybe in a Western university. So you have to think about the strategic question, right? But don't let that dominate your intellectual agenda, because it's a form of corruption. If you're choosing your research topic based not on where the gap in knowledge really is, but what will appeal to somebody, is not that far away from wondering, should I write this because somebody's paying for it? Right? So I'm not saying they are on par. We also have to be pragmatic. And I'm not saying don't think about the job market. But let me assure you that outside of the United States, the US is a parochial market. And there, even a project in France and UK and Canada is as useless as a project in Bangladesh, right? Unless it's about the US, it's unlikely to matter. But American law schools, right? This is not true of American politics and American sociology schools, by the way, right? But outside the US, a good Bangladeshi project, by which I mean where you're actually interested in what Bangladesh is doing rather than using Bangladesh just as a bounce, sounding board, but actually be of more value, have better reception than trying to enter into the abstract political theory debates, which basically presume a British or a European or an American background, whether explicitly or implicitly. Right. So what I'm saying is that there is a lingering imperialism that forces scholars of the South to come to believe falsely that talking about their jurisdiction is not worthwhile. So I think being self-aware of that self-belief, which is racialized and which is colonized, is hugely important. Bangladesh is home to millions of a huge chunk of humanity. How could it possibly not be of interest? Right. So that's the first thing I would say, that we have to challenge the internalized racism in all of us, which colonialism obviously manifests in, and the lingering impact of colonialism. And the second, even on the strategy question, taking Bangladesh seriously in this literature, my judgment is strategically better than doing an abstract political theory project, because again, that space is crowded, it's overdone. And there's very little, I think, that it's very hard to say something new in that field. I'm not saying you can't. What I am saying is you will do that much better by taking Bangladesh and its laws seriously.
Yes, thank you, Tarun, for your remarks. So I think besides every other thing that this wonderful discussion made, I think it also compelled us all to take hard questions and decide things like not choosing your tribe or not deciding to take the what ought to be question. So we've come to the end of the workshop, and before we end, I would like to thank our JFF team, Animesh Das, Harishankar, and Deva Prasad, who have been constant support in the background along with me. And thank you, Tarun, Swati, and Dinesha for the discussion today. Thank you, Reza, for being the author and choosing Junior Faculty Forum as a platform. Wishing everyone a meaningful weekend and happy Diwali to those who are celebrating. Thank you.
Thank you.